Long Live the King, from a story by Mary Taylor Coleridge, written about 1900. She was the great grandson of a brother of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The king was too young and too good to die, but that was his fate. He lay in a simple bed in his favourite room in the palace, the garden room. It wasn't quiet in the room. It was toing and froing of people bustling in and out, trying not to be loud, elevated conversation, shuffling of feet. In previous days, the major domo had been at the door and had admitted only his closest friends. But now his physician said he knew nobody and could hear nothing. The major domo was not at the door, and friends, close and casual, had come to pay their last respects and to gossip about the new king. In the late afternoon, the king stopped breathing, his heart stopped. His doctors declared him dead. His visitor shuffled past the last time and thought how serene and peaceful he looked. Flowers were brought in vases, candles were lit, guards were placed, the windows were open to the garden. Many hours later, when he regained his senses, the king lay back in the dark, savouring what his senses brought him. The smells and the sounds. The smell of the burning candle wax. The scent of the cut flowers. The smell coming in from the open windows from the garden. The sounds of his guards who had all fallen asleep were snoring quietly. In a nearby room, prayers being offered in unison. Further off, kitchen sounds, a meal being prepared. In the distance, the bells of his city were telling of his passing. The great clock in the palace began to strike. He counted 11. And then he remembered that just before his illness entered what was to be the last phase, a voice had spoken to him and had said, if in an hour after your death you can find three people who mourn your passing, I will restore you to life. The king was a dutiful man. When he descended the throne, knowing what wretched conditions most of his people lived in, he had set about a program of reforms. But now he could see that what he had accomplished was very little compared to what he had set out to do. Duty called, and he answered this last opportunity. As he left his room, he thought of going to see his wife, but he couldn't face her tears. And in any case, it would be better to go to her when he had come back with 300 or 300 or 3,000 names of those who mourned him. As he left the palace, the child was sitting on the steps crying. The guard asked her why. She said, well, my mommy and daddy are in the palace because the king has died, but I don't know when they're going to come back. I haven't eaten, I'm cold and hungry, I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. I do wish the king hadn't died. The king passed on, amused that the first person to mourn him was a child, and for purely selfish reasons. He made his way to the home of his best friend and most trusted advisor, a man with whom he had spent many evenings planning the reforms that he intended to make. The courtyard of the house was full of activity, lights being carried to and fro, horses being saddled. He made his way to the study where they'd spent many hours. Chaos, papers scattered everywhere, broken glass on the floor, the picture frame. He recognized the picture. It was of himself. He had given it to his friend not long before his illness had struck. A fire in the grate, a half-burnt letter. He recognized the handwriting. It was the last letter he had written to his friend about some matters they had discussed. Just then a man and woman entered the room, the man in a riding habit and boots covered in dust, an ambassador to a land several days' ride away. The woman was a senior member of his friend's household. "Where is your master?" asked the man. "Why, he's gone to pay his respects to the new king, of course," said the woman. "It's a very anxious time for us all. He was known to be so close to the late king that it will stand in his way with the new man. Of course, they see eye to eye. They both disagree with the ridiculous reforms that the late king attempted to make. My master spent many hours in this very room trying to dissuade the late king from some of his more foolish proposals. Of course, he was fond of him in a way, but people in our position have no time for sentiment. I sent his retinue will follow. My master left as soon as he heard the king had died. His retinue will follow as soon as they're ready." The ambassador said, "Yes, I know about foolish proposals. He obliged me to make peace. The army didn't like it," he said. "But the new king is in favor of war, and soon there will be promotions in the army again." The king passed away. The king went away feeling betrayed personally and about the ideals that he believed he and his friend had shared. But he knew where to find people who needed his help, who had needed his help. The poorest of his citizens in the oldest part of the town. On his way, he stopped at the state prison where he knew a condemned man was waiting to be executed. As he entered the cell, so did the warden and the chief jailer. The man looked up. He said, "I thought it wasn't until tomorrow morning, but if now is the time, I'm ready." And the warden said, "No, it's not for that we've come, but to tell you that the king has died, and is the custom, death sentences have been commuted." The man's face fell. He said, "He was so young, and such a good king." He said, "Why is it that a wretch like me, the life of a wretch like me, should be spared, while a good king has to die young?" The king walked on, astonished that somebody who was such a habitual criminal and committed the most dreadful crimes should be one of the few who mourned his passing. He went to the old part of the town, found several of the men with whom he had listened in disguise over the years. He had observed the wretched conditions in which they lived, listened to their views, and incorporated some of their needs into his reforms. He found several men he knew at a bar, sitting around a table. He stopped to listen. The first man said, "I'm glad he's dead. He was such a penny pincher. Nothing will ever come if the man at the top isn't going to spend anything more, hate me more than he has to," he said. "But the new man has different ideas, and soon trade will be moving again. You watch it." And the second man said, I agree. He was a nosy Parker, forever sending people into our houses to inquire about sanitation and hygiene. He said it was none of his business. And a third man said, "I hate all kings," he said, "but if you have to have one, I'd like one who can stand up to his missus, however pretty she is, and who knows his port from his sherry." And another man said, "Yes, his ridiculous proposals, like abolishing capital punishment. All he wants to do is make money out of prisoners in jail, keep them locked up for the rest of their lives and make money out of them. That's all kings ever want to do." The king went away, astonished again at the betrayal, at the change in views of these men whose opinions he had valued. The clock was striking 3/4 hour. There was little time left. He made his way back to the palace, to the third person who he knew would mourn him. He entered his wife's sitting room. She was sitting by the fire in the dark. A ring on her finger glinted. It was the only light in the room. He knew of the ring. It was one he had given her shortly after they met. She promised never to take it off. But she was alone, and he wondered why none of her ladies-in-waiting had stayed with her on this first night of her bereavement. Just then there was a noise, a sound in the corner of the room. A door opened. A man stood there. She ran to him and threw her arms around him and said, "I'm so glad you've come," she said. It was awful sitting there holding his hand and thinking he was going to haunt me forever afterwards. But now you're here and I feel safe. We'll never part again. And I have something to give you," she said. She took the ring from her finger and gave it to him and said, "You must promise me never to take it off." At midnight, the guards all woke with a start when the clock struck. They saw that the king was still lying there, stiff and stark as before. But they noticed a great change had come over his countenance. They said, "Cover his face. We must not let his face be seen again."